It started with a whisper. Laura first heard it while she was jogging through the Freetown-Fall River State Forest, her favorite spot to escape the suffocating pressure of her life. It wasn't loud, nor was it clear. It was just a faint, breathy sound weaving through the rustling leaves. "Laura," she stopped, her sneakers crunching against the gravel path. Her earbuds were still playing faint music, so she blamed it on her imagination. She chuckled to herself, shaking off the chill that crept up her spine, and continued running. That evening, as she was rinsing dishes in her tiny apartment, her phone buzzed with a text. It was from her friend Sarah. "You've been running in Freetown, haven't you?" Laura frowned, texting back a casual, "Yeah, why?" The response came faster than she expected. "Get out of there. Don't go back. Ever." The words felt like ice settling in her veins. Laura called Sarah, but it went straight to voicemail. A creeping unease filled her kitchen as the phone screen dimmed. Outside, a faint wind rattled her window, and for the briefest moment, she thought she heard her name again. She told herself it was nothing. The forest was just a forest after all. She'd been running there for years, but her dreams that night betrayed her resolve. In the dream, Laura stood in the middle of the forest, surrounded by the towering pines. But something was wrong. The trees were watching, not with eyes, but with a suffocating sense of intent, as if the entire forest held its breath, waiting for her to move. Then came the whisper. This time it wasn't faint. It was right behind her. "Laura." She spun around, heart hammering against her ribs, but there was nothing. The forest was empty, except for the eerie silence pressing down on her. But as she tried to step forward, her feet wouldn't move. They were sinking. No, the forest floor was pulling her down. She woke up gasping, drenched in sweat, her sheets twisted around her legs like restraints. She stared at the ceiling, her chest heaving, and swore she could still feel the cold soil on her skin. Her phone buzzed again. It wasn't from Sarah. It was an unknown number. "Come back. We're waiting." Laura stared at her phone, her pulse thundering in her ears. She didn't recognize the number, but something about the text felt wrong. The screen seemed colder in her hand, the letters sharper. Her instinct told her to delete it, to pretend it never happened, but her thumb hovered over the message, drawn to it in a way she couldn't explain. The sound of her neighbor's dog barking outside jolted her, snapping her out of the trance. She locked her phone and tossed it onto the counter, forcing a nervous laugh. She was letting her mind run wild, that was all. Sarah's weird warning and the unsettling dream were just coincidences. But even as she tried to move on with her morning, unease clung to her like a second skin. At work, Laura couldn't focus. The fluorescent lights above her desk buzzed faintly. The chatter of her coworkers faded into the background, and she found herself scrolling through old photos of her runs in the Freetown Forest. The towering trees, the golden light filtering through the canopy, the stillness of the trails. It had always been her sanctuary. But now, even the photos seemed off. She stopped on one picture, her favorite, a selfie she'd taken on a crisp autumn morning. The sunlight had hit just right, making the leaves glow in brilliant shades of orange and red. But as she stared, something shifted. In the corner of the frame, hidden in the shadows of the trees, was a figure. It was faint, almost translucent, like a smudge on the lens. But the longer she looked, the clearer it became. It wasn't human. The limbs were too long, the body too thin. It was hunched, as if it had been watching her when she took the photo. A cold shiver ran down her spine. She slammed her phone face down on the desk and squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to breathe. "Hey, you okay?" Laura jumped at the sound of her coworker's voice. It was Mark, the IT guy, peering at her with concern. She forced a tight smile. "Yeah, just tired," she lied. But the truth was, she felt anything but tired. She felt hunted, That night, she couldn't stay in her apartment. The walls felt too close, the shadows too deep. She grabbed her keys and drove aimlessly until she found herself pulling into the parking lot of the forest. She didn't remember deciding to come here. It was as if something had guided her hands, her thoughts. The forest loomed in front of her, dark and endless, the wind whispering through the trees like a voice she couldn't quite make out. The text buzzed on her phone again. "We knew you'd come back." And before she could think, before she could turn around, a branch cracked behind her. Laura froze, her breath catching in her throat. The sound was sharp, deliberate, like someone or something was stepping on purpose. Slowly, she turned to face the source, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might break through her ribs. The parking lot was empty, bathed in the dim glow of her car's headlights. The forest beyond was a wall of blackness, but she felt it. Someone was there, just out of sight. "Hello?" she called, her voice trembling. No answer. Just the sound of the wind brushing through the trees, and then another crack. Closer this time. Laura's fight-or-flight instincts kicked in. She fumbled for her keys and rushed back to her car, the weight of something unseen pressing on her back like a pair of cold hands. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her fingers shaking as she started the engine. The headlights flared, cutting through the darkness. And that's when she saw it. At the edge of the forest, just beyond the reach of the light, stood a figure. Tall, impossibly thin, its limbs too long for its body. Its face, or what should have been a face, was featureless, a pale, smooth void. Laura gasped, her body frozen in terror, her fingers gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The figure didn't move. It simply stood there watching her. Or maybe it wasn't watching. How could it without eyes? But she felt its gaze, felt it like a weight pressing down on her chest. She hit the gas, her tires screeching as she sped out of the lot and down the winding road away from the forest. Her hands were slick with sweat, her vision blurred with panic. She couldn't shake the image of the figure from her mind. Her phone buzzed again. "You can't run from us." Laura's breath hitched as the car suddenly jolted. It felt like she'd hit something, but the road was empty. She slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop, her heart racing. She sat there for a moment, gripping the wheel, her eyes darting to the rearview mirror. The road behind her was dark, empty. But then the mirror shifted. At first, she thought it was her eyes playing tricks on her, but the reflection warped, the shadows twisting into a shape. It was the figure again, standing in the back seat. It leaned forward, its faceless head tilting unnaturally close to her ear, and whispered, "You should never have come back." The scream ripped from her throat as the car's lights flickered and went out. Darkness swallowed her. When Laura opened her eyes, she was no longer in her car. The air was damp and cold, carrying the earthy scent of moss and rotting leaves. Her head throbbed as she tried to focus, but the world around her was wrong. Silent, oppressive, as if sound itself had been stripped away. She was in the forest, though she had no memory of leaving her car. The trees stretched unnaturally high, their trunks twisting like grotesque figures frozen mid-scream. The moonlight barely pierced the dense canopy, leaving the ground in a suffocating gloom. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she stood on unsteady legs, the gravel path from her usual runs nowhere in sight. "Hello?" she called out, her voice swallowed by the silence. It felt like the forest itself was holding its breath. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the leaves, but growing louder, overlapping, until they filled her ears. She clamped her hands over them, her knees buckling. The voices weren't just speaking. They were crawling into her mind. "Laura, you shouldn't have come back." She staggered forward, desperate to find a way out. But every step seemed to lead her deeper into the forest. The trees closed in around her, their gnarled branches clawing at her clothes and skin. The whispers followed, growing more insistent, more malicious. "Do you remember what you've done?" One voice hissed, low and venomous. Another laughed, cold and mocking. "They never forget, Laura. Neither should you." Panic clawed at her chest. She didn't understand. What were they talking about? She stumbled into a small clearing, the oppressive whispers fading just enough for her to catch her breath. But the relief was short-lived. At the center of the clearing was a tree unlike any other. Its trunk was blackened and split, oozing a thick, tar-like sap that pulsed like a heartbeat. Around its base were objects, personal items, a shoe, a scarf, a child's toy, all caked in mud and decay. And then she saw the photos. There were dozens of them, pinned to the bark of the tree with rusted nails. Her face stared back at her from each one, frozen in time. In some, she was jogging through the forest. In others, she was sitting in her car, staring at her phone. One showed her sleeping in her apartment. The curtains opened just enough for someone to have taken it from outside. Her stomach lurched. This wasn't possible. How could these photos exist? Who had taken them? A low, guttural growl rumbled behind her. Slowly she turned, her entire body trembling. The figure from the parking lot was there, but it wasn't alone. Dozens of others emerged from the shadows, their elongated forms impossibly silent as they surrounded her. Each one was slightly different. Some had jagged limbs, others moved on all fours. But they all shared the same faceless void where their features should have been, and they were all staring at her. One of them stepped forward, its movements jerky and unnatural. It tilted its head, as if studying her, and then it spoke, not with words, but directly into her mind. "You can't hide from the truth. Laura, we are what you buried." Her knees gave out and she collapsed to the ground, her mind racing. Buried? What truth? The whispers returned, louder than ever, suffocating her with fragments of memories she couldn't piece together. And then it hit her. The grave. The word grave echoed in Laura's mind, her breath coming in sharp, ragged gasps. She tried to block it out, but the memory clawed its way to the surface, dragging her back to a night she'd spent years trying to forget. She was 19. It was her first real summer of freedom. Parties in the woods, bonfires with friends, no rules. That night, there had been too much alcohol, too many reckless decisions. She remembered the fight, the shouting, the way Sarah had begged them all to stop, and then the sound, the sickening crack as Sarah had fallen backward, hitting the ground with a lifeless thud. They'd panicked. It had been an accident, they told themselves, but none of them had dared to call for help. Instead, they'd done the unthinkable. In the dead of night, they dug a shallow grave in the forest and buried Sarah beneath the roots of a twisted, ancient tree. No one ever found her. The guilt had gnawed at Laura for years, but she'd buried it, just like they'd buried Sarah. She'd told herself to move on, to forget. But the forest hadn't forgotten, and now it wanted her to remember. The figures closed in, their faceless heads tilting in eerie unison. The whispers grew louder, blending into an unbearable cacophony. "You left her!" one voice hissed, filled with venom. "You buried her like she was nothing," another snarled. Laura shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't supposed to happen," she screamed, her voice cracking. The figure in front of her stepped closer, its elongated limbs twitching unnaturally. "You lied to yourself, Laura. You thought the forest wouldn't remember, but it always remembers." The blackened tree behind her began to creak, its split trunk widening. From within the darkness, a hand emerged, thin, pale, and unmistakably human. Laura's breath caught as more of the figure pulled itself free, mud and roots clinging to its form. It was Sarah. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollow, her mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. She stepped forward, her movements slow and deliberate, Her gaze locked on Laura. "You left me here," Sarah rasped, her voice cracked and dry, like wind through dead leaves. "You thought I wouldn't come back for you." Laura scrambled backward, her hands clawing at the dirt. "I didn't mean to. I was scared. We all were," she sobbed, the weight of her guilt crushing her chest. Sarah's head tilted, her empty eyes narrowing. "Scared?" she repeated, her voice dripping with venom. "You didn't feel fear that night. You felt relief." Laura opened her mouth to protest, but the words died in her throat. Sarah knelt in front of her, her muddy hand reaching out to touch Laura's cheek. The touch was ice cold, and Laura's vision blurred as a wave of nausea rolled through her. "You can't run from this," Sarah whispered, her smile widening unnaturally. "You belong here now, just like me." The ground beneath Laura shifted, the dirt softening and pulling at her limbs. She screamed, clawing at the earth, but the harder she fought, the deeper she sank. The faceless figures watched silently as the forest claimed her, their heads tilting in perfect synchrony. The last thing Laura saw before the darkness swallowed her was Sarah's face, twisted into a grotesque grin. And then there was silence. The forest grew still once more, the whispers fading into the wind. Somewhere deep within its tangled heart, the blackened tree pulsed faintly, its roots stretching just a little further. And in the distance, on the empty path, the faint sound of footsteps echoed. Another jogger, another soul drawn into the forest's endless hunger. Weeks passed. Laura's disappearance became just another headline, lost in the constant churn of news. Her coworkers speculated, her neighbors whispered, but no one truly knew what had happened. The official report was vague. Abandoned car found near Freetown-Fall River State Forest. No signs of foul play. But those who knew the forest and the stories it carried spoke in hushed tones about what might have happened. One of those people was Mark, the IT guy from Laura's office. He couldn't shake the look on her face the last time he'd seen her. That haunted, faraway stare. Something had been wrong, and he regretted not pressing her about it. Late one night, unable to sleep, Mark found himself scrolling through old messages from Laura. The last thing she'd texted to the office group chat caught his eye. A picture of her usual running trail in the forest. He didn't know why, but something about the photo compelled him. He stared at it for what felt like hours, the shadows between the trees seeming to shift the longer he looked. Before he knew it, he was in his car, driving toward the forest. The parking lot was deserted when he arrived. His headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the familiar trailhead. He hesitated, the engine idling, but something unexplainable pulled at him, a force he couldn't resist. Mark stepped out of the car, the chill of the night air biting at his skin. The forest loomed ahead, its branches twisting together like skeletal fingers. With each step he took, the world grew quieter, the hum of distant traffic fading into nothingness. He followed the path Laura had photographed, his flashlight sweeping over the dirt and roots. The silence was unnerving, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. And then he heard it, a whisper. It wasn't clear at first, just a faint sound carried on the breeze. But as he moved deeper into the forest, it grew louder, more insistent. "Mark." He stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight trembling in his hand. His name echoed through the trees, overlapping, each voice slightly different. He spun around, his pulse racing, but the path behind him was empty. Then he saw it. In the distance, just beyond the reach of his light, was the blackened tree. Its twisted trunk seemed to pulse, a faint glow emanating from the cracks in its bark. Mark felt an overwhelming urge to move closer, his legs carrying him forward despite every instinct screaming at him to turn back. When he reached the tree, he saw them, the photos. Dozens of them, nailed to the bark. But these weren't of Laura. They were of him, Pictures of him at work, in his apartment, walking to his car. Images that no one should have been able to take. His stomach churned as he stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering, and then the whispers stopped. The silence was deafening, pressing in on him like a physical weight. Slowly, he turned, and there they were, the figures, dozens of them, emerging from the shadows, their elongated forms and featureless faces eerily still. One stepped forward, its movements jerky, unnatural. It tilted its head, mimicking curiosity, and then spoke, its voice echoing inside his skull. "You didn't come here by accident, Mark. You were chosen." He wanted to run, to scream, but his body wouldn't obey. The ground beneath him shifted, the dirt softening, pulling at his feet. The figure leaned closer, its faceless void inches from his own. "The forest remembers," it whispered. "And now, so will you." As the ground swallowed him, Mark's flashlight flickered and went out, leaving the forest in darkness once more. The blackened tree pulsed faintly, its roots spreading ever wider. Somewhere in its hollow trunk, a new photo appeared, a picture of Mark, staring back with wide, terrified eyes. The forest waited, it always did,